Actually, the topic that we're talking about, which is Bittul in Habad Hasidis, is so vast and so great that 20 minutes is not going to do justice for this topic. But we're going to have to do some tzimtzum also in the Bittul, and to squeeze yourself in this tiny space of time that is allotted to me. I say that usually I'm a pulpit rabbi, so usually when I speak as a rabbi, I know that 7-8 minutes is the most that people could listen to. But then when I give classes, it's an hour. But then we have a farbrengen, it takes a whole night. But academic time of 20 minutes, I still didn't master yet. But we'll try. Okay, so Bittul, which means self-nullification. Now, the way I try to present it over here, to explain a little bit what Bittul is, those that are within Hasidus and they're within Habad are very familiar with this term. It's actually a very common term. But outside Habad, the term is a little bit kind of convoluted, complicated, exactly to understand what the word Bittul means. Now, I'm trying over here to juxtapose two ideas, which is Bittul, the Hasidic idea of Bittul, versus the common idea which we call Dveikus. Now, the concept of Dveikus, which means cleaving, which is based on the biblical verse, many biblical verses that we have in in this coming parshas as we read in the biblical order. We have terms, V'atam adveikim b'Hashem Elokeichem, you should cleave to God. And boy tidbak, and so on and so forth. Boy, all those verses have in them the imperative to cleave to God. Now the question is, what does it mean? What does it mean to cleave to God? Now, everyone who's familiar with this topic, it's not something that I'm coming with a new idea over here. So we have the concept of dveikus in Gemara, in Talmud. The Talmud says, what is dveikus? How do you able to cleave to God? How is a person able to attach himself to the divine? How is he unifying himself with the divine? So the Talmud famously says, in the language of Chazal, of the Talmud, it says, is it possible that a person should cleave to the Shechina? Why not? Because it's fire that consumes. You cannot get close to God. That's the question of the Talmud. So the Talmud says, very practical answer. Indeed, we cannot cleave to God. What's the solution? What does the Bible mean? The Bible therefore says that a person should cling to the scholars, to the sages. Hadbik b'Talmud Chacham, cleave to the scholars, and therefore that's the vehicle somehow to come close to God. This is the the Talmudical reply on this question. What exactly is Beit Sitbak? This exists in Talmud, and many Chazalian Midrashim have the same idea in there. However, the idea of Dveikus eventually went through a certain revolution. We know that in the Kabbalistic world and in the philosophical world, the idea of Dveikus took on new meaning, and the meaning that we have in the specifically in the mystical world meant, which we translate kind of the idea of mystic unio, that a person is like mystically clinging and connecting himself to the divine in some ways. Now, of course, in order to be able to accomplish this type of mystical unification that the mystics talk about, a person has to indulge engage in the mystical teachings of specifically the structure of the Kabbalah, how the Kabbalah has the whole idea of the meaning of the divine and the presence of the divine, the emanation of the divine, the whole theurgic construct that represents the view of the Kabbalah. What does the divine presence mean? Now, of course, if a person is engaged and he studies in those Kabbalistic ideas of the divine presence, so supposedly through hard labor and hard work, a person could eventually merge, so to speak, with this divine. He could have some kind of cognizant merging with the divine presence. You know, there's the famous expression, Ila Yadaita Vehisiv, correct? Which means the famous aphorism, which is mentioned in by the famous Ran, the famous Talmudic scholar, the Rabbeinu Nissim. So he says, he has this famous expression, Ila Yadaita Vehisiv. If I would know God, I would be God. Meaning to say, you can't know God, and therefore you cannot be God. That's the famous, comes actually from earlier, it's not clear from where the source comes from. The Ran says a certain scholar, lately they found that it's also in the famous works of the Reb Levi from Provence, the famous controversial scholar in his works. So, Reb Levi Bar Avram, what's his name? So he also has this statement. Now that actually says that a person cannot know God, therefore we cannot connect, we cannot have any connection with God. The Kabbalists, however, said we could know him and therefore we could be with him. We could somehow merge with the divine in some ways by knowing him, and therefore is a method how a person could cling and also cleave to God. That's the approach of the Kabbalah, which I'm not going to quote the many quotations which attest to this idea, which is a very common idea in the Kabbalistic world, the idea of Dveikus. In some ways, this goes against the Talmudical understanding of Dveikus. This contrasts with the Talmudical, and this idea of Dveikus arose with the popularization of the spiritual movements that started from medieval period in the philosophical world, like the Chovet al-Vavot, and then the Kabbalistic world, which more or less emerged at the same period. So, and from that period on, we have different understanding what Dveikus. How to reconcile that with the Talmudic view, this is not our task at this point. But of course, the Makubal definitely didn't think that he's disagreeing with the Talmudical view. He understood that somehow these views, this is really what the Talmud means in his understanding. It's, obviously, that's the real interpretation, how the Makubal understood, the Kabbalist understood the Talmud itself. He didn't understand that it's a dichotomy over here, but rather some kind of synthesis that exists, a kind of like you could merge these two schools of thought. Now, the understanding of Dveikus, which persisted for many centuries, this concept of Dveikus, which again meant that the person is engaged with the divine. He's like climbing towards the divine by a certain mystical cognization that a person has, by himself, his own spiritualization. When a person spiritualizes himself, when a person is somehow, he's actually becoming a mystical person, and through that, he's able somewhat to get some kind of merging, a dveikus, a connection, a cleaving with the divine. Well, of course, there's different spherotic ideas over here. Is the malchus of the divine, or different types of levels. It's a field on its own to really understand the different nuances between different schools of thought. But this is the general act of the Mekubal, of the mystic whose task and his purpose is to get to this state of dveikus. This means the ultimate level of spirituality. The apex of his achievement is when a person can get to this dveikus. This is where he's aiming at. This is where he's trying to reach when he's doing whatever he's doing as a Mekubal. Now, of course, when Hasidus arose, which is famous as one of the spiritual movements in the 18th century, and it brought spirituality to a broad part of society. Really, at that point, if the Mekubal was meant for a certain elite, Hasidus, of course, was more attractive to a bigger part of of society. It wasn't limited to only a certain elite. And Hasidus was a mass movement, and it attracted from all walks of life people to the spiritual quest. That the spiritual quest, it was only prior to Hasidus, to a very minor elite unique society. However, when Hasidus came, it popularized, democratized, so to speak, spirituality. Now, it's common to understand that when Hasidus came to deal with those spiritual ideas that existed prior to Hasidus, which is generally the mystical tradition and the philosophical tradition, what Hasidus was generally democratization. They democratized these ideas and popularized them in order to have popular consumption. And what Hasidus accomplished was to dilute somewhat the very powerful experience of the individual Makubal, who the individual Makubal has this quest to rise and spiritualize himself and sanctify himself, which includes a lot of different rules and complicated structures that a person has to follow, different advice, which usually comes with every Kabbalistic guide. If you start reading the works of the Ari, which is the Lurianic works, so the Eitz Chaim has the introduction, how a person, in order to study these things, has to sanctify himself. He has to really elevate himself. He has to divest himself from all physical desires and from all kind of from all different carnal pleasures. And as more as a person is able to accomplish that, the higher he's going to able to achieve the goal of really unifying himself in this quest of Dveikus. That's the Kabbalistic. Now, Hasidic view is commonly that it's a popularization of kind of emotionalism, of a spirituality which is more democratized. It didn't demand from a person really this self-negation that is commonly understood is the stepping stone in order that a person should enter that very rarefied life of the Makubal. Chassidus relaxed the rules, and therefore it popularized it in different manners. In the Hasidic world, we have suddenly the word Hasidim, which used to be a term, of course, only attributed to people who really are unique. And even in Talmudical times, the term Chassid belonged to a very few people who, from the sages itself, deserved this term. And Hasidus came to democratize the term. Suddenly everyone is a Chassid. So the question is that true? In other words, is Hasidus just a continuity of that concept of Dveikus, just popularized it and democratized? However, the truth is that that's not what Hasidus accomplished. And I always say when I teach about Hasidus that Hasidus has a very big problem inherent within Hasidus itself. The Hasidic movement was born out of, as I say, as a movement, as a personal movement. Of course, the Besht himself, the founder of Hasidus, didn't start as most founders of movements. They start to write a text. And the text actually attracts people, and the people attracted to the text are following usually the text. This is the common manner of most movements and most people who established new Hasidic movements or new philosophical movements. It usually started from a philosophy, and the philosophy was followed by the people who attracted this philosophy. The Hasidic movement didn't start in that manner. Everyone knows that the Besht, when he appeared, didn't come with any text, and it actually was indifferent to text, or rather even hostile to text. In the early Hasidic tradition, there's a tradition that says that somebody wanted to write down the words of the Besht. So the Besht says, absolutely not. He totally was against writing down any of his teachings. And of course, at the end, some teachings were somehow recorded, like kind of by accident. Now, the reason why this exactly happened, that the text was not inherent or actually integral to Hasidus, is, as we can explain immediately, what's the reason for that. Now, what happened was that the Hasidic movement, that's 5 minutes. Okay. So the Hasidic movement was actually a movement that was the point of Hasidus, and this we're going to have to skip this point that I want to say. The point of Hasidus is therefore the essence of Hasidus, I could say, and the main idea of the Hasidic movement is the concept of what we call Bittul. Now, the term Bittul, I didn't see it existing prior to Hasidus. The term Bittul by itself as saying the avodah of a person is to be Bittul per se. You should self-nullification. Of course, we have already batal ritzoincha, in order to negate your will and give up your pleasures and give up your desires for the sake of God. Or you have the concept of achnoah. A person should submit himself and be humble, and he should be actually exhibit humility in all his ways and all his. But the concept that is in Chabad Hasidus, I'm talking now from the language of Chabad Hasidus, the concept of what we call bittul, or even the terminology as you should be bottle. You should absolutely be nothing. You should be self-negating in a very substantive sense. In other words, not that you should give up something, not that you should be humble, but rather you should be absolutely what we call bittul. The term bittul comes, of course, from halachic term. It's an halachic term, which means if somebody is familiar with the halachic term that you have like kosher and non-kosher and they're mixed together. So if you have a minute non-kosher stuff which merged or really was mixed in a pot. So we're saying if it's 60 kosher is more than a not kosher, so it's bottle. It's bottle. We assume that it doesn't exist. It absolutely lost its identity, and therefore it absolutely not existing. Now, this term of bittul is borrowed from this halachic term. We're telling a person that he should be bottle. To what should he be bottle? Of course, it is derived from the cosmic idea of what Hasidus came all about to teach us. Hasidus came to teach us that the world by itself is bottle. In other words, the reality is bottle. The reality is not existing in a real sense or a somewhat real sense. So out of that concept, out of that idea, we have the avodah that is demanded for a person, that what is his purpose in life? When we ask a chassid, what is the spirituality of the chassid? What is the dveikus that a chassid has to achieve? So we're telling him, we don't ask him that a person should elevate himself in order to climb the rungs of the ladder, the sulam, and until he's able to reach the spiritual divine level, and therefore at that moment when his spiritual divine level, the person in his full-fledged identity and in his refined identity is able therefore to merge himself with the divine presence at that level which the Makubal understands that this is divine presence. Now, to the chassid, what we're asking him really to do, which is not easier, I don't know if it's easier than the Kabbalistic idea that we're asking him to do, we're asking him, which is quite a tough demand, we're asking him to have and accomplish the sense of self-negation, of self-nothingness. As much as a person could achieve this notion that he could not spiritualize himself, but rather self-efface, or rather self-negate, and not self-negate, negating his desires or his pleasures, but his mere identity should somehow be diminished in somewhat. This, for the chassid, is the ultimate achievement. Now, what does it mean that he's self-diminishing? How is a person self-diminishing? The ego and the self, of course, remains here as an existing thing. However, we're asking him, and this is the process of meditation that exists in that exists over here, that the meditation demands for a person to ponder and contemplate the reality of the divine presence, which the divine presence is so ubiquitous and so all-encompassing that there's no space for the person really. You should find and recognize and have this view how your space is absolutely occupied. You are occupying a space that is already, there's a presence over there. You're really kind of an interloper on someone else's space. Who's the someone else? That's the ultimate divine presence of God. That's the presence of the person. Now, the chassid's life and everything that the chassid does, I'm finishing in a few seconds. Now, the chassid, whatever he does, and whatever, in other words, when he studies Torah and when he does mitzvahs, or he davens, anything that a person does, the ultimate purpose of everything has to come to this goal. He has to find out how that act in particular is able to allow him to self-diminish. If he feels or he senses that his ego grew by doing a certain mitzvah, even a spiritual ego, I'm not talking about a very coarse or crass type of ego, but any kind of addition to himself. So according from the Hasidic perspective, he actually didn't accomplish his task, what he was supposed to do. That's the general perspective that Hasidus try to accomplish. I don't know if accomplished, but it at least try to do that. Now that's the kind of doctrine which was taught, and it was was imparted, and it was actually not more than in culture. This type of idea created a whole culture, which the whole culture revolves around this idea, how a person should achieve this idea somewhat. Now, this type of spirituality, the question is, how does it relate to people outside this tradition, or this? How do we could derive any benefit of this concept of spirituality, which we call the concept of Bittul, self-negation? Now, of course, the modern world is based on exactly the opposite. Everything in the modern world is self-achievement, self-accomplishment. A person thinks, which has justification, that when a person accomplishes something, he enhances himself, then he's satisfied. This gives him satisfaction, and this accomplishment is the ultimate goal of a person in the modern world. Now, the question is, can we have a minor dose of this Hasidic idea of self-negation? That a person should think that, yes, we allow him to accomplish things, and he has to accomplish things, but at the core of his existence, he should perhaps think that maybe his presence and his existence is doubtful on its own. In other words, and of course, most psychological problems, or we of course, we're not over here. This is a fine thing that we have to discuss, and of course 20 minutes doesn't allow to discuss it. Self-negation is not nihilism. Self-negation, 1 minute, I'm finishing. Self-negation, of course, is a certain sense of not expecting that everything that you think that you need should be accomplished in the way you thought that it's needed. That's like the kind of practical understanding of what we call this self-negation at the core of a person's existence. Now, this type of spirituality is a different type of spirituality, and that's usually what the Hasidic movement, when they talk about dveikus, which dveikus is cleaving, is the way how Hasidus accomplished this dveikus was through this method. By self-negating, you're really merging and unifying yourself with God from a different perspective, from a different kind of like, from a different method. The method of the Kabbalistic way is self-affirmament. A person is affirming himself. But here, when a person is self-negating, he meets God in a different view, from a different point. So that type of thing is what Hasidus means when they talk about dveikus in the Hasidic world, even though they use the same terminology. I just want to say finish one word, and there's an interesting discourse, a homily of Reb Shneur Zalman, which he writes, and here is, you could see the essential difference between these two ideas. The common, of course, term of humility is anova. So there's a homily of Reb Shneur Zalman, a discourse that he says, well, it says that a person should have humility in front of God. And that's the ultimate accomplishment of anova. Is a very famous Jewish idea. Anova versus arrogance. Now, Reb Shneur Zalman writes that to understand the concept of anova, what's so important about anova? He's speaking, of course, from his perspective. So, of course, he says, once we understand this concept of self-negation, that a person understands how he's completely in the face of the infinite presence of the God, of the divine, his presence is absolutely not, doesn't have any right to exist, so to speak. So that's the idea that through anova you're achieving divine presence, or you're achieving divine recognition. It's not anova as humility. It's anova in the sense of feeling naught in the face and the presence of the divine presence, which is all-encompassing. Therefore, your own presence absolutely is not allowed to exist. That type of Anova, from his perspective, allows the person to really sanctify himself through the divine. This is the ultimate sanctification of Anova. This perspective is at the essence of the Hasidic movement.